had really learned about state building or nation building, and that these were lessons that were going to be implemented in the future. But I think, as most of you know, this didn't seem to happen, and a lot of these really important lessons were kind of suddenly forgotten. And so people wonder why these weren't institutionalized, why these lessons didn't stick. And I think it's really interesting to hear former ambassadors talk about this, particularly James Dobbin and Ronald Newman, who have both still been very involved. Not only was James Dobbin very involved in the Balkans, but he continues to be involved in efforts in Afghanistan and Iraq. And they had a lot of reasons, and it wasn't just about kind of the people who were in power at the time. It wasn't just about the Bush administration. So I'm going to talk about some other reasons. But first I want to talk about a central ideology that I believe was developed and implemented by the Bush administration. And it was this belief in doctrinal unilateralism. And I'll define it. My former professor, John Ruggie, at Columbia University, and now he still works for the United Nations, he talks a great deal about this set of ideas, this ideology that the Bush administration had, which he called doctrinal unilateralism. And it's defined this way: the belief that the use of American power abroad is entirely self-legitimating, requiring no recourse to the views or interests of others, and permitting no external constraints on its self-ascribed aims. So one reason I think that these lessons from Bosnia, these lessons from the Balkans, were not learned and implemented was because of these ideas and because of the people who were in power in the United States. But that's not the only reason. I think there were other reasons that I'll talk about, kind of more structural reasons that constrain institutions, that constrain states in lots of ways when it comes to state building. But let me talk about the different lessons that the Bush administration learned from the very same events. So we're still talking about, they're looking back at Bosnia and Kosovo and saying, okay, we didn't do everything right, but we got some things right. But what they learned from those same set of events were totally different lessons. The first lesson that the Bush administration learned is nation building is not only possible, but it can be quite successful. If you look, and Defina and I Defina's used this word a lot, if you look at the discourse that came out initially with Afghanistan and Iraq, it was going to be pretty easy. They were going to throw flowers at our feet, that these whole enterprises were not only doable at one point in time, and I remember this quite clearly, they talked about health care for all Afghans, for Afghanistan, and developing a legitimate and a really widespread health care program in Afghanistan. Sitting in the United States, I thought that was rather shocking, that they were talking about health care there rather than health care in the United States. But there was this sense that, for some reason, that Bosnia and Kosovo had been not only successful, but had been kind of easy and doable. So this idea was really pervasive in the early periods of state building in both Afghanistan and Iraq, that state building was not only possible, but that it was going to be relatively easy. The second belief within the Bush administration was that military force is an effective tool for U.S. foreign policy. Again, what's very interesting, when now all these books have been written by military experts and people who were on the ground initially in Afghanistan and Iraq, and Ambassador Newman talking about this as well. Lots of plans for the military part, virtually none for the day after. What happens once stabilization starts? I mean, it's really, it's more than scary. I mean, it's just downright shocking that these other plans weren't made. And when people are talking about, what else was in motion at that time, it was really about military force was almost going to do it all, and that was going to be the end of the story. The third lesson was that support from allies was nice, but not necessary. So exactly the opposite lesson that we thought was the take-home point in Kosovo. We need our allies, and our allies are great, and this multilateralism adds to our legitimacy. It adds to this new world order. In the case of Iraq and Afghanistan, it was, if our allies want to help out, that's okay, but we don't really need them. And that was another very surprising kind of take-home lesson. The United States government may wish that its allies are expendable, but in reality, they were influential. And I think what's really interesting is to have someone like James Dobbins, who's been working for the US government for many years. He's at the Rand Corporation right now. But for him to say, and his books, he has this whole set of books on nation building, that the United Nations has done a much better job. And it really does learn lessons. These lessons stick around a lot longer in the United Nations than they do in states, because he's done a book on the EU and nation building, the UN and nation building, and the US and nation building. And of those three kind of sets of actors, he would put his bets, he would place his bets on the United Nations. Finally, I think that in some ways, for some Americans, Bosnia and the Balkans have really spoiled us. They led us down this road. They lured some Americans into thinking that American values are global values. And when people within the administration started talking about what the world wanted, what the Afghans wanted, what the Iraqis wanted, there was this sense that because the United States had led efforts in Bosnia and had been successful in Bosnia, that really our values were global values. It really lured people into believing that. Finally then, why is this so, right? Why is it that states, and again, not just the United States, we can talk about other states, we can talk about Kosovo, we can talk about Bosnia and Germany, states have a really hard time learning. They really do. So when I was looking, or doing this more theoretical paper on learning and how learning happens and organizational learning, one of the first things that most people talk about is the importance of individuals, right? Who's in charge of an organization says a lot about the policies. It says a lot about learning and when learning happens. But what's more interesting in the literature is not just the individual, the person in charge. If it was, George Bush in charge, it was not all kind of his fault, and it wasn't only just about one individual, but it's the people who surrounds that individual, who surrounds that leader, and then the decision-making style that they use. For me, it's very interesting to look not only at the people who were within the administration talking about state building in Afghanistan and Iraq, but who wasn't in the conversation, who was not asked to come back. James Dobbin was not asked to come back initially to talk about Afghanistan and Iraq. Robert Perdido, also another state building, nation building expert. People who, military experts who had really worked hard to make things happen in the Balkans, were not asked back by the Bush administration to hear diverse opinions and perspectives. In fact, what we're now learning is that the style, the decision-making style was, if you don't support me, and if you're not on my side, you're against me. So if people had differing opinions, instead of weighing, and this is intentionally what some good organizations and structures try to do. They surround themselves with really competent people with very diverse perspectives so that they can weigh choices and options and look at the past and learn to improve policies. But that seems to be, maybe not absent, but there was, the Bush administration was really challenged in that regard in terms of inviting people to have diverse perspectives in the leadership style. The second reason is, as we all know, states are fundamentally self-interested actors who have certain foreign policy goals and objectives, and these goals change over time. And everyone knows that after 9/11, things changed fundamentally within the United States. And suddenly that world, that new world order that was a kind of a combination of chaos and change, but also consensus, overnight, the Bush administration adopted a very different foreign policy tone, attitude, and set of policies. But again, in terms of structures and when learning is more likely to happen, learning is more likely to happen within organizations that intentionally have different people representing different perspectives, representing different objectives, so that they can debate and discuss and consider options and alternative plans. They can consider and weigh the choices that they're making. So learning can happen and be more effective when different goals, short, medium, and long-term goals are all considered, as well as the options and alternatives. Third, foreign policy is an organic process. and it's subject to lots of changes on the ground. And I think Ronald Newman talked about what was happening in Afghanistan and how a lot of things, the decisions were not made, the initial decisions were made in DC, but then once the state building process started happening, it was really hard for those policymakers to go back and read, well, what were some of the lessons learned, what should we do based on what happened in the past. A lot of foreign policy is done on the fly. And it's just reacting very quickly, using the information that you have, and trying to figure out how to make things work. One suggestion that the ambassadors gave in terms of the United States in improving learning was to really make sure in state building exercises that really experienced people are on the ground. So not only so they can make better decisions, they have more experience to draw from, but also so that people in Washington will listen to them more. Finally, learning is particularly difficult in the United States, but I think in other countries as well. This is something we talked about with regard to European countries, because of a lack of institutional memory. During the Clinton administration, there was efforts to develop the Coordinator for Reconstruction. Now we have this office for the Coordinator for Reconstruction. It has very little power, very little money, and it took many years for this institution that was supposed to be kind of a gathering place for information and individuals to come together to talk about state building. It took many years for this institution to actually be created, for a director to be appointed, and still the office. I tried to interview them the last time I was in DC, and they said, well, there's no reason to interview us because we really had virtually nothing to do with Afghanistan and Iraq. You know, we're just kind of starting to get a staff now. They have very small staff. So this desire to develop some institutional memory has also, it's been a big challenge in the United States, but in other countries as well. Although someone from the UK was telling me that they have developed a range of different institutions, not only within the military, but within the government, to try to take some of the lessons learned and to hopefully implement them in the future. So my final word on kind of Bosnia lessons learned is there should not be a question mark. Maybe there should be something else at the end, because states do learn. But states, just like people, often forget, and they can choose not to learn. So I don't think that we really need a question mark. It's just a way of developing mechanisms to make sure that those lessons are really institutionalized and that we learn from them. So thank you.